What's up everyone, Patrick here, and in this video what we're going to do is go through an overview of what economics is. So this is going to be a very high level overview, and then as the course progresses, as the videos progress, we'll get more and more into detail. But you'll see in those future videos I'm going to be coming back to this higher level overview that we're going to go over in this video. So before getting into details, I feel like just having that bird's eye view of where everything fits in is going to help you file things in your mind a little bit better, and then it's going to make your studying of the more detailed concepts later in the course a lot smoother of a process. So to start off, basically economics in its very raw fundamental form is the relationship between a consumer and a producer. And more specifically, what happens is that a producer provides a consumer with goods or services, and then a consumer provides the producer, in exchange for the goods and services, they provide them with money. Now, this relationship here, or this transaction, if you will, is the raw building blocks of economics, of what economics is all about. And you'll see throughout the course, even when we're dealing with more advanced concepts, I'm going to be continually bringing back this relationship over here. Now, a couple of things I want to mention about this. Number one, there could be other parties involved, not just a consumer and a producer. A good example of that, there may be like government involved. You can kind of think of that party as being sort of on the sidelines of this relationship, perhaps regulating the relationship, and we're going to cover government in future sections. Another thing I want to mention is I wrote money over here, and this money could mean a lot of things. It could mean income that you're receiving, but it could also mean debt or credit. So if you purchase something on a credit card, you're using debt or credit to purchase that good or service. But in this video, we're going to focus more so on income that you've made, that money that you received as a consumer, and then you're going to use that income to buy goods and services from a producer. But then income can also be classified into different things, as we'll see later on. So income could be from labor, from wages from your job, but let's say you have a bunch of real estate. It could also be rent that you're receiving, or if you have investments, it could be interest. Okay, so that income can come from different sources. Another thing is that I could have actually made this relationship here even a higher level overview, could have generalized it a bit more. And instead of writing money, I could have wrote medium of exchange, because money isn't the only thing that could be given to receive a good or service. You may run into scenarios where a good or service, for example, is given for another good or service. And this here is called a bartering transaction, which we'll cover in a future video. However, most transactions these days is like this. Money is given for a good or service, right? It's very rare that a good or service is given for another good or service. This was more back in the day when money wasn't created yet as a medium of exchange. Another problem with this here is that it's tough with a bartering transaction to classify one party as a consumer and the other party as a producer, because notice that they're both consumers and producers in this transaction, right? This party here would be a consumer because they're receiving a good or service, but they're also a producer because they're giving a good or service. So it's hard to kind of differentiate these parties with a bartering transaction. So not only does this deal with most cases, but it also gives us the benefit of differentiating those two parties into a consumer and producer. Another thing I want to mention is in certain sections, you're going to see consumer and producer described by different words. So for example, when we're going to talk about demand and supply, sometimes you'll see the consumer be described as the demander and the producer is going to be the supplier. Or sometimes a consumer will be described as a buyer and then a producer will be described as a seller. Or a lot of times a producer will be called a firm. Even sometimes it'll be called society. Okay, so you're going to see different words come up for both of these parties. And I picked these two words, consumer and producer, because I feel like they're the best words that sort of encapsulate all these other words. But when these other words do come up in future sections, I'm going to mention where they fall. So even though I'm going to bring back this general relationship here, if in your course you're going to be talking about a firm, I'll be talking about a firm more in the video, but at the beginning of the video I'll mention that a firm falls under the category of a producer. Okay, so now let's get into a little bit more detail with this transaction. So notice here how a consumer is given money to a producer to get a good or service. Thing is, money doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It has to have a source. And so money is made from income. That is the word we're going to use for the source of money. And again, this income could mean a lot of things. Wage, it could mean rent, it could mean interest, as I mentioned before. For now, let's just keep this word income over here. And then these goods or services, they don't just appear out of nowhere. They have to be made. And goods or services are made or produced from resources. That's the word we're going to use to describe the source of these goods or services. Another good question to ask here is, why is this transaction happening? What is a consumer ultimately trying to get? What is a producer ultimately trying to get? So a consumer is getting a good or services, but let's dig in a little deeper. Why are they buying this good or service? And the answer is that a good or service provides the consumer with satisfaction. And in economics, we don't really use the word satisfaction. Another word for satisfaction is utility. Right? That good or service is providing the consumer with utility. So if a good or service ceases or stops to provide a consumer with utility, this transaction will no longer happen. The consumer will not be buying that good or service anymore. So a good or service has to continue to provide the consumer with utility, with a certain satisfaction. And then over here, what's money giving to a producer? Money provides the producer with profit. That's ultimately what a producer is seeking. They're seeking profit because once they have profit, they could reinvest that profit to make even more goods or services and to just keep that cycle going. So if a producer stops making profit, it will no longer produce this good or service. So this transaction will no longer exist. Or on the other side, if a good or service doesn't provide the consumer with utility, this transaction can also stop because the consumer will no longer buy that good or service. So two different reasons of why this relationship, why this transaction could cease to exists. So knowing this here, let's actually make a more detailed flow diagram. So let's start with a consumer. What's going to happen is they're going to have income, which is the source of money. And then we have a producer. They're going to have resources, which is going to allow them to create, to produce, to make a good or service. And then that good or service is going to flow to the consumer. This money here is going to flow to the producer. The good or service is going to provide the consumer with utility. I'll write it over here on the arrows. And then money is going to provide the producer with profit. Now, in a perfect world, how would a perfect world look like for a consumer and a producer? So let's describe two scenarios here. A perfect world for a consumer would be receiving infinite utility. Okay, sometimes you'll see this, wanting infinite utility, infinite satisfaction. Sometimes you'll see this being called unlimited wants. And we'll come back to this, unlimited wants, when we talk about something called an economic problem. I'm going to mention it soon. So in a perfect world, a consumer would want infinite utility from infinite consumption of goods or services. While a perfect world for a producer would be infinite profit from infinite production of goods or services. However, unfortunately, because we live in the real world, there's going to be an issue with both of these scenarios here. What's the issue for a consumer? Why is receiving infinite utility, infinite consumption of goods or services, why is that an issue in the real world? Well, there's a limited amount of income that they have. And sometimes you'll see this called in textbooks as the budget constraint. Okay, because consumers have limited income, they're going to have limited money, which means they could only buy a limited amount of goods or services. So receive a limited amount of utility. They can't receive infinite utility. And then the issue for a producer of receiving this infinite profit, well, the very source of this profit, if we follow all the way, resources. That's the ultimate source of profit for a producer. And in the real world, there are limited resources. And so those are the two respective issues that consumers and producers face. And in regards to these two issues here, a word that you'll see come up in economics is scarcity. And if you look up the word scarcity, basically means the state of being scarce or the state of being in short supply or limited or a shortage of something. And so applying scarcity to economics, consumers face scarcity because of limited income, and then producers face scarcity because they have limited resources. And so from this scenario here, we can actually create a definition of economics. You may see different definitions in different textbooks. The way I like to think of economics is the study of how consumers and producers make decisions under conditions of scarcity. So notice, because scarcity exists, because consumers have a limited income, producers have limited resources, both of these parties have to make choices on how to use their limited income and limited resources, right? So choices are decisions. So economics is basically the study of how consumers and producers make decisions under these conditions of scarcity. Another thing that you'll see many textbooks mention is this scenario here from both sides. It's called the economic problem. And again, a concept that you may see different definitions of. A popular one is they'll say that consumers want or have unlimited wants. That's where that unlimited wants expression comes from. So consumers have unlimited wants, but producers can't satisfy those unlimited wants because they have limited resources. So a lot of times this definition of an economic problem, they'll just look at this and then mention this because they all sort of connect, right? I like to look at everything, but yeah, this is a popular definition for an economic problem, quote unquote. Consumers have unlimited wants, they want infinite utility, but producers have limited resources. And that's pretty much it for the higher level overview of economics. That's what economics is all about. I know it's a bit of a drag sometimes to get through this sort of general stuff, but again, I feel like understanding all of this, understanding that flow diagram that I had up before, it's going to make your studying a lot smoother in the future. It's going to allow you to take advanced concepts in the future and file them in your mind a little bit better, and you'll know where they fit according to this higher level overview. Now, last thing I want to mention before finishing off this video is we talked about the relationship between a consumer and a producer, but in reality, there's not just one relationship, there's going to be a bunch of relationships in the world. And they don't have to be necessarily individual, sort of isolated relationships. For example, a consumer in this relationship, they might be a producer in another relationship, or this producer might be a consumer in another relationship. So this all can interconnect as well. And so in the real world, there's going to be a bunch of these relationships or a group of them. Sometimes you'll see the word aggregate come up in textbooks, and aggregate, the way I like to think about it, is just a collection of consumers and producers. And these kind of aggregates could be different scales. So you might be looking at all of the consumer and producer relationships in a certain city, or might maybe scale it up and look at it for a whole country. Right? So there's different scales of this aggregate here. Now in economics, there's actually two branches of study. There's microeconomics, which is what this course is going to be based on, and there's also macroeconomics. And so microeconomics, what it does is it studies or looks at these individual consumer and producer relationships, while macroeconomics looks at the aggregate or the collection of these relationships. So a couple of examples of topics that are going to be studied in microeconomics in this course is the price of a product that a consumer is going to buy from a producer, or what product or service or what good or service should be produced, or supply and demand also is going to be related to the price of that good or service. That's going to determine the price. So stuff like that is going to be microeconomics. Macroeconomics looks at the aggregate. So you're going to see concepts like GDP come up, gross domestic product, and gross domestic product is the market value of all of the goods and services produced in an aggregate, usually a country. That's what you're going to be looking at. So that would be a concept covered in macroeconomics and stuff like inflation and fiscal and monetary policy, et cetera, right? But just in general, microeconomics studies individual consumer and producer relationships, while macroeconomics studies a collection of the consumer and producer relationships. And sometimes you'll see carryovers of concepts that are studied in both. So for example, supply and demand, as I mentioned, it's going to be used when we're talking about the price of a product or service. But supply and demand is also going to be used when we're looking at the currencies of whole countries and the different currency exchange rates between countries. Right? So sometimes concepts can be used in both of these branches of study. But again, this whole course is going to be based on mostly this individual relationship. And one more thing I want to mention is it doesn't just have to necessarily be a consumer and one producer. We might run into situations where we're looking at the relationship between one consumer and multiple producers. When we're talking about different markets, certain competition, monopolies, and perfect competition, and sometimes the other way. We might look at a producer and their relationship between multiple consumers, or deciding which type of consumer does the producer want to produce goods and services for. Right? So just take this with a grain of salt, but thought I would just show it to you visually, the difference between those two branches.